Hello everyone, I hope you're doing great. Today we are going to have our seventh video from the conversation activity video series. Today we are going to focus on culture, so without any further ado, let's get going. The terminal objectives, the purpose of our class is to help our students answer a set of argumentative questions and they have to use reasons in order to answer these questions. They're expected to express their opinion about culture. They define the word culture. They have to talk about cultural events, for example, festivals, rituals. They will be expected to talk about culture shock and alienation. So basically, culture shock is when people move to another country either as tourists or as immigrants, and they would be culturally shocked because of the cultural diversity which exists between their own culture and the recipient country's culture. And then we have alienation. Basically, it means losing your identity, losing your personal self, becoming adapted, synchronized with the foreign culture. And finally, they're expected to be able to talk about globalization. It means the concept of having a kind of cultural unity or proximity and being able to live in peace and harmony despite cultural diversity. So students are expected to talk about these. For enabling objectives, how we are going to enable our students to talk about these concepts, we will advise them to use a set of grammatical structures. We have participial adjectives and gerunds in this regard. For example, trying exotic food is quite interesting to me. So ing form of the verb is absolutely useful, absolutely essential to describe cultural activities, cultural events. So I love drinking at the cafe and reading literature. It is fascinating. So fascinating is an adjective. It describes the whole sentence: reading in a cafe, drinking at the cafe. So basically it's a kind of participial adjective, and drinking, reading, these are all gerunds. So you can absolutely adopt this kind of grammatical structure in order to talk about culture. In terms of lexical resources, we have expressions of approval for people who accept foreign culture. So they use cherish a foreign culture, cherish a tradition, recognize, adapt, or accept with an open arm. So cultural diversity, especially by tourism industry, would be accepted in some regions with open arms. So some countries, for example, let's say Turkey, which is recognized for its tourism industry, accept the other cultures. They cherish cultural diversity. The opposite is expression of refusal, how we fight with any kind of cultural diversity, how we have a kind of astringent character, refusing any type of cultural diversity. So we have to ban cultural diversity. To refuse a difference, to refute is the same, or to reject a change. So these are concepts that we can use in order to refuse a kind of difference. Cultural identity. So we have festivals, rituals. Basically, festivals means a kind of events, musical events, let's say movie events, or even distribution of prizes, such as, for example, in Golden Globe. These are all festivals. We have rituals. Rituals basically means a set of religious ceremonies practiced normally. For example, let's say praying before a meal in some Western countries, or sometimes praying for rain. If we pray for precipitation, then it is called a kind of ritual. And it has been the case, especially in the past, in many Eastern countries, especially in Asia. By literature, it means novels, books, written artwork of any kind, which would be another example of culture. We have national heritage. For national heritage, we mean all buildings, monuments, historical places, museums. So these are the heritage which is remained, passed on through generations for our nation. We have gastronomy, everything that is related to food, delicacies, let's say useful materials, ingredients, how food is served, table manners, everything is about gastronomy. And then we have music, different genres of music, different styles, different singers. So music is another example of culture. There are some useful expressions. Quintessential, it means basically the most important example. For instance, let's say dizi and kebab are the quintessential foods in Iran. So perfect examples of Persian cuisine, Persian food is dizi kebab. And perfect example of, let's say, Iranian drink is dugh. So these are quintessentials. Cuisine, it means the cooking style of a country, unique to a country, and it is perfectly in line with the adjective of a nation. So simply use the adjective of a nation right before cuisine in order to talk about their cooking style. For example, Persian cuisine is quite famous for its chunky stew. So the Persian cuisine is renowned internationally for its chunky stew. And we use Persian, which is an adjective of, let's say, Iranian people, right before the word cuisine. And then we have ubiquitous. Ubiquitous means prevalent everywhere, something that you could find almost everywhere. For example, Chinese food is a kind of internationally renowned food, and you can find them almost in any country. So Chinese food is ubiquitous these days all around the world. The same thing goes for Italian food. For example, I think you can find pizzas and pastas everywhere, all around the world. So it is another example of a kind of ubiquitous food. Now let's plunge ourselves into actual IELTS conversation activity planning. Before attending the class, we will ask our students to watch a set of videos. The first one is, let's say, IELTS Speaking Task 1, Questions and Answers in the Framework of Culture. Very useful video, very short, to the point. The second one is having a kind of useful expressions and vocabulary for culture and leisure and how we spend our leisure time more in detail. And finally, we have a full video, a long, about a couple hour video containing all about culture and leisure. This is absolutely a must for IELTS candidates, but should be avoided at all costs in case the students are in a hurry. In the class, the first thing we do is focus on worksheets. So students are asked to provide definitions and as many examples as they could. In terms of culture, we have cultural events, we have festivals, we have rituals, we have seen them. We have cultural greetings. So we have another sign of cultural difference. Some people shake hands in some other countries, some people bow, and sometimes we have kissing a hand, especially ladies. It is customary for men to kiss ladies' hands whenever they want to greet a young woman. And we have hugging. So these are different means of greeting, and of course these are cultural. For definitions, we have dress code, so how people are clothed. In some countries, dress code is really reserved. So, for example, ladies try to cover themselves from head to toes, while in some other nations, dress code is quite different. Dress code is more liberal. We have formal clothes, basically what you wear at work, for instance, suits for men. Or informal clothes, t-shirts, jeans, these are types of informal clothes. Casual clothes are also something similar to informal clothes. We have code of conduct. Code of conduct basically means behavior, how we behave. It could be almost anything. For example, not increasing our voice in front of another person, especially if it is an elderly person, to not interrupting another person while talking. Or for instance, when we are on a bus, if we leave our seats in favor of an elderly person when there is no empty seat available, this is a kind of code of conduct, a type of right behavior which is accepted as a norm in the society. We have global village, a place where everything is perfect, everything is at its ultimate quality, there is no crime, and people are ultimately satisfied with their quality of life. So this is the concept which is right now imaginary, unfortunately, but you can always talk about globalization. So whenever you have global village, you probably have some opportunity to use the word globalization. Globalization means to accept the kind of cultural unity or proximity of people despite their cultural diversity so that they could live in peace and harmony. And this is in line with global village. So the purpose of globalization is to make a kind of global village for the entire humanity. And another set of topic related vocabulary. So whenever we talk about culture, we can talk about customs, traditions, ceremonies, rituals, norms, etiquettes, values, and stereotypes. So these are the accepted concepts that we have directly linked to culture. For the conversation activity, we will always ask a set of questions. This is far from being comprehensive, but you can always ask students to answer these questions. So how important is to preserve culture? Basically, I think it's quite important because otherwise we would lose our identity. A country's culture is directly linked to arts, civilizations, to the identity of every single individual in that culture. So it is quite essential. Otherwise, we would lose ourselves. We would be alienated. How important is to learn other countries' culture, other people's culture? Absolutely, absolutely essential. Otherwise, we would be under culture shock. If we move to another country for studies, for example, we may be culturally shocked, and we would be facing some difficulties synchronizing ourselves to the social values of the recipient's country. In this regard, we have to learn other culture, especially this is the case for immigrants, people who try to migrate, they try to live in another country for their entire life. Therefore, they have to learn the other culture. They have to learn the recipient country's way of living. Do you think food is an integral part of a culture these days? Yes, of course. How food is served. For example, in some countries we have raw food, for example, sushi in Japan, while in some other countries food is baked or cooked thoroughly. For example, we have steak well done, the meat is well done, it means perfectly baked. So, in this regard, food is a kind of cultural concept. Even how it is served, for example, we have table manners. We wait for the elderly people to come before we could start eating. So it's a kind of cultural code, cultural behavior. Or in some nations, people pray before starting to eat. Do you think people care less for their culture these days, and why? I think yes, especially when it comes to youngsters, because they have an in-depth exposure to foreign culture through social media, through Instagram, through Twitter, Facebook, and etc. For example, what we call it as a like sign, the gesture for like, thumbs up, is considered a negative sign in Iran, and it was a kind of abusive structure, abusive expression, and people try to avoid it at all costs. But since our youngsters, our teenagers are normally liking each other's posts on Instagram or Google, so the meaning of that negative gesture is nowadays changed. So in Iran, it is absolutely customary to use this sign, and people are almost forgetting the fact that originally this sign was a negative one and it meant something quite different. So, yes, I think people care less about their culture these days. What is your impression about globalization? Well, I think by the growth of internet technology, you can always say that globalization is in effect. We are going to recognize cultural diversity. We are going to understand what is the way of living in other countries around the world. So yes, globalization is a positive influence and it is going to change the world towards a kind of global village. Do you think it is easier these days to learn other cultures compared with the past? Yes, of course. Again, due to technology, internet-based technology, people can get acquainted with each other. People could simply travel overseas. In the past, they had to spend a longer time in order to move from one location to the other. Nowadays, we have jet engines and airplanes, so people could move to another place quite conveniently with spending the least amount of time possible. Therefore, it is much easier to be exposed to a foreign culture in order to get to know how other people live. In terms of assessment, we have formative assessment. We assess our students based on their performance. We always try to give feedback to our students once they have finished the conversation. It is absolutely essential not to stop our students in the middle of their performance. Otherwise, we risk, let's say, demotivating our students and even sometimes distracting them from the focus of the topic. We also have to focus on enabling objectives. In this case, enabling objectives mean the use of gerunds and participial adjectives such as interesting, fascinated in order to talk about our likes and dislikes in cultural activities. And finally, we give them tips. We provide some answers. The same thing I did for the previous slide. We give them sample answers, but this is just a description of better alternatives. It is absolutely our students' responsibility to, let's say, personalize this answer for their own use. At the end of the class, we will have homework assignments, and as always, we will provide some IELTS task 2 cue cards related to culture for this topic of our today's conversation activity. And we will ask our students to record themselves for at least a couple minutes and send it to our colleagues in the correctional department in Parsi Institute for constructive feedback. So that's it. I hope you have enjoyed. Next conversation activity for the next video would be about technology.